So most of the diversity here in Arizona's ponderosa pine forest is in the understory, as you can't see here. What we have is largely pine needles and clumps of fescue, and you get a little bit more grass as you go up slope, but that's only because we're in a narrow band of timber. There's a draw on either side of us. But if you look in this area right in the foreground and extrapolate that across hundreds of acres, that's a typical understory for much of our ponderosa pine forests as they are today. But just on either side, we have these contiguous patches of pretty lush grass because it's an opening. So what Forfry is trying to do is go from these continuous middle-aged forests and open them into patches of closed canopy trees with nice understories surrounding them. And if you think about traditional silviculture, you plant trees maybe every 9 or 12 feet apart, so each tree maximizes the water and the nutrient available. Well, a group of trees under the German model is bad because you have competition. But if that group is surrounded by an opening, then they all get to send their roots out to minimize the competition. And then it's relatively fire safe, because if one group torches, it's not likely to continue as a high intensity canopy fire. So what we'd like to do is move forests like what's behind me into groups dominated by older trees. And if you look behind me, this area, like most of the northern Arizona ponderosa pine, is dominated by middle-aged trees. Historically, they were the large older trees, which are great for wildlife, especially birds. So what we're trying to do is move it back, and there's this shared vision now amongst the stakeholders and the Forest Service on what that looks like. Where does that come from? Well, if you look in back, you could see some charred stumps. And then off to this side, we have a lot of stumps, the high stumps that we talked about earlier. That's evidence of the historical forest. And then logs, we have an older log right next to us here with the young log behind it, and you could see the difference. So the one in front of us would be an evidence of the historic structure. So Ecological Restoration Institute's done a lot of work in rebuilding the historic forest structure in sites around northern Arizona using some of the very first research plots the Forest Service ever initiated. And they've gone back. Margaret Moore has published several articles on this. She's relocated most of those plots, remeasured them, and can build the forest structure from historic to today's conditions. And one of the things she found is that understory production, on average, across all sites, is somewhere between 1/3 to 1/2 of what it used to be historically. And if you think about an ecosystem, what powers the ecosystem? Well, if you think of what birds and small mammals eat, it's either vegetation or the arthropods. Where do you get that? Primarily the understory. What do the bigger animals eat? Well, either vegetation or smaller animals. So when you lose the understory, you're basically taking the foundation out from the structure that we hope to regain here. And so a shared vision in Forfry was manage so that we can rebuild the understory, allow it to come back on its own by creating open conditions. And that's good for fire, because what carries a fire? Well, the understory. It's good for wildlife, because I was just talking about what's good for wildlife. And then it's good for silviculture, because if you bring the understory back, you have enough openings for the forest to remain healthy. And our forests are currently unhealthy. Mistletoe, the bugs, the beetles, competition between the trees. So we don't have resilience in the system. And with climate change evident on a regular basis now, we want resiliency so the forest can hang in place as long as possible. Eventually, we're probably forcing a switch. It's modeled to juniper. We might not even stop at pinyon juniper. But if we can retain the pine as long as possible, then hopefully more species can adapt and survive.
Remember we talked about structure, pattern, composition. Those are three kind of elements of restoration. So if we talk about the structure and the size and age class of trees, you can see these are all the same age. They're actually relatively young, maybe middle age, 60, 90 years old, but they're only maybe 30 years old, and they're pretty consistent throughout the landscape. I don't know if we're able to pan a little bit to the right here, but we can see we keep going. There's a real large tree, and you can see the marks on that tree indicate that that tree is going to stay. And that's one of the trees that we call a site index. That tree is indicative of the potential of this particular area. So we know that we can grow some pretty big trees in here. That tree is not that old. Comparatively speaking, it's probably just over 100 years old, but it's managed to grow in open area with very little competition. So it's really reached the dominance in this particular stand. And so as we put all those things together, so we look down at the understory, we look at the soil type, predominantly a limestone soil type. We look at the past evidence, so we got the stumps here. You see one that's partially burned. We know that it wasn't particularly dense. All those things drive us to our management, I guess, goals and objectives and directives. So we know by the preponderance of evidence that this place was pretty open. And then that actually leads to then what species do we manage for? We've got a whole suite of species that we would manage for based on the maturity of the stand. So if we have an old age forest, a mid-age forest, or a young forest, we're going to manage for different species. And so there's different components that each of those species require. One that we're going to talk about a little bit later, obviously, is the Mexican spotted owl. That occupies a very specific habitat niche, and we'll get into those characteristics of that habitat a little bit later. But again, what species of trees do you see growing here? You only see one, and it's ponderosa pine. That's it. You really don't see anything else growing here. So all of those clues put together really drive the management for any particular site. And that's one thing that I know Bill was talking about restoration, particularly with forfry, is we're not trying to get it to any particular time period. We're just trying to put it back on that trajectory to increase resilience within the stand, so it can stand up to disturbances like fire or bugs or anything that may be coming down the pipe. We just want to build the resilience in the system. And what you're seeing right now, there's not much resistance in here. It's really just a desert of ponderosa pine.
It seems kind of odd, but one of the controversial species in the development of forfry was the Abert squirrel. Rodents have high reproduction, and so I wasn't expecting that would be a big deal. But it's also, we had management indicator species at the time. That's evolved into a new category. But we had a range of defined species between endangered species, sensitive species, and management indicators. And the squirrel is a management indicator. The idea is if you do too much or too little of something, and you see that you monitor the squirrel population, it'll reflect that change, and you'll know if you're having a positive or negative impact. So the concern was, under the contiguous forests of today, we have squirrels basically across broad areas. And if we start moving it to groups of trees with openings around them, are we going to lose squirrels? And in this case, we let the Arizona Department of Fish and Game do the analysis, since it's a game species. And I provided a paper that looked at historic levels of species as well as they could. So some of it was modeling, some of it was old data sets. And it kind of matched what the forests have been saying all along, that we would expect a decline in squirrels, but they'll probably level out at a population level higher than what we had historically, because the forests are still going to be denser than they were historically. We can't just magically change an entire landscape. But one way to track what's happening with squirrels is based on their feeding habits. If you think of this as a live branch, squirrels will come out onto the branch and they chew this end off and it drops, and then they chew this next section off, and then they strip it and eat the cambium. goshawk researcher Dr. Richard Reynolds would call these bones. So you look for bones and the clippings. And if you look down here at the base of these trees, you'll see a lot of bits of pine needles and these bones scattered in. All of this is fallen from up above where squirrels were feeding. So squirrel sign is very common in these forests. A lot of birders miss that because they're looking up. You have to look down for this. But the expectation at the end of forefry is maybe fewer squirrels than today, but likely more squirrels than what we had historically. And that's important as a game species, but also because it's a key food for goshawks. And essentially everything we managed, about every acre of forefry was either managed for goshawks or spotted owls. And that may sound a bit menacing to a silviculturist, but we'll get into this more as we stop around in these areas and look around more. But there's wide latitude under both species that allows us to move back towards the historical range of variation.
Okay, we're looking at another site that has historic evidence. You can see the stumps right in through here. There's a group, little ridge of 5 there. There's another little 4 back in there. These 2 guys right here, and then back further stumps here. It's about a 20 tree group, about 2/10 of an acre. So that helps us understand the pattern that should exist on this landscape. This is actually, we're in the middle of the Clark Task Order, which is in the Elk Park Hazardous Fuels NEPA project. And how we actually designated these trees, the orange trees or leaf trees, is based on the evidence. So you look at the first site we looked at, you could see 2 or 3 of those larger stumps around, which suggests that was definitely more open. And then this little group here. But when you look further up the hill here, and where's our next group? You can see it's not that continuous stand of trees like we saw on the hill where there's so many young trees together. So that's how we also get to that 25 to 125 trees per acre across the landscape, from this kind of evidence and this kind of and studying the patterns across the landscape. So our landscape is not a one-size-fits-all by any means. It's dictated by a lot of different factors. How much moisture you get, soil type, soil depth. So that first site, without actually looking at a soil map, just a few trees per acre on it, it was probably actually a mollisol, which is actually a grassland soil type. So grassland soil types develop over thousands of years, actually, very high organic matter. That's because they don't have that tree component. So this is probably a mix to that. And then the upland site where you can barely see a few stumps. So that was very open, these little ridge tops. This whole site was very open, but very different based on all the factors that go into slope aspect. North slopes usually more trees per acre, just because it's wetter, they retain moisture longer. So our whole thing in the Southwest is the limiting factor here is moisture. So when you get in those large groups that we had before and you saw no understory, a lot of competition for that moisture. That's where we get our bug outbreaks. Out here, natural mechanism to get rid of bark beetles and so forth is actually amount of water, and actually pitches them out. So a much more open forest is much healthier, more resilient to those kind of those stressors on the system. As Bill mentioned as well, the more adapted to climate change. But that's how we help read the landscape out here to actually get to our desired condition.
That's true. Back into the Mountain Air Project, just before the video before, we were in actually Elk Park, which there's just a road separating. Very similar treatments. But if you look out here, we talked about 70% of the trees being removed, and that we were doing a leave tree mark. Remember, any trees that had a mark on them were staying. No mark, they got cut. And so you can see the stump field kind of across the area out here, and you can see there's quite a few trees that were cut. You look at the trees that were left. If you look up on the ridge a little bit, you can see that those are some of the yellow barks or some of the older trees where we're not targeting older trees. They're still here, very open, lots of grassy understory coming in. Kind of what we expected here, especially for an urban interface treatment. So remember, the priority for the project, Mountain Air project, was urban interface in fire. We want to mitigate fire entering the community. So how do we do, right? I think we've done pretty good. This has been cut now for about 3 to 4 years. And if you look out, remember the first stop that we made, lots of small trees growing in. That one had been about 9 years after treatment. Do you see that here? Why? What's the difference here between soil types and maybe rain patterns? There's really no difference. Same project, same soil types. If we scope a little more to the right, you can see some of the real large trees. Obviously, those are the structure that we want to retain. And even though they're spaced pretty far apart, if you're able to pan up, those crowns are almost touching, which is very important for squirrels that we talked about earlier. And squirrels are important because they're a prey species for many other critters. So we talk about trophic levels. I don't know if you guys have talked about trophic levels, but it's basically who's eating who, right? If you look at the ground, we got lots of food for mice. Hawks and owls are feeding on the mice. Elk and deer are feeding on the stuff that's growing on the ground. So it's who's eating who. And that's another consideration that we put into play when we talk about these projects. I think Dick can talk a little bit about what's behind us and kind of how you manage for a timber sale and what you're left.
So when we have done our National Environmental Policy Act document that actually defines our desired conditions, and then we take that and put it on the ground to try and implement it with trees and large size trees, we try and do that through some kind of forest product removal. This actually was a timber sale. We have multiple mechanisms to do that. But when you do that, when you're removing 70% of the trees, you obviously, how do they go from the stump actually to a place where they could be loaded on a truck and taken to a sawmill? So what we do is we actually have a logging plan, and we actually cut the trees, and you can see over here right behind us is a skid trail. When you drag this many trees across the ground, it actually gets to open ground. And so especially on a slope, we want to try and mitigate that through our timber sale activities. So to do that, you see a whole bunch of logs and limbs and stuff spread across that. That's actually, we spread slash on that to create surface roughness to make sure it doesn't erode. So that is one of our mitigation measures through our logging activities. When we go back over here, I mean, we brought all the big pieces that are operable and can be taken to a mill. Some small pieces, depending on the project, we'll take down to 1 inch and actually grind that up and take it to a power plant or to a soil amendment site. This was a traditional timber sale, so we had everything over 5 inches, and all the slash, so all the activity fuels, all the limbs, were actually left at the landing. So we had to pile that, put it in piles, and then actually, to get rid of it, we burn it. So that's one of the issues we have when we're looking at can we actually have the material removed? That's preferable, because every time you light something on fire, you create smoke, and smoke is a big social concern for us. And we prescribe burn. We want to actually burn very frequently. And the more we burn, actually, the less smoke emissions we have, because we're burning finer fuels every time. When we do this first entry, we're going to be burning logs, we're going to be burning larger pieces of material. That creates a lot of smoke, a lot of residual. As we burn more, less smoke. But that actually creates some issues at our landings. That's what it's called. We skid it down to a landing. We actually take the trees, we bring the whole tree, and we'll see some examples of that at our next stop, of how we cut that and take it as that whole tree and actually move it to a landing. We actually delimit, then we take the limbs, the merchantable pieces, ship that off. Everything else goes in a pile, and we burn it. So one of the things we try and do, what we want to try and do, is get rid of those piles as much as possible, because smoke is a huge social concern and a huge health concern for not only the public, but for our firefighters as well, who actually have to implement those burns. So these are some of the other issues, and we talked about regeneration coming in. Henry noticed, haven't got it here quite yet. It could happen. But these are other issues when we're trying to implement mechanical restoration. There's a lot of activities that go on. It's not just cut the trees and we're done. We've got to actually treat those fuels. Actually, some work at these piles, what happens is they burn and they scorch the soil. It gets rid of the mycorrhiza, soil mycorrhiza in there. As a mitigation measure, we can actually re-inoculate that by actually just taking shovelfuls of dirt out here from the forest, actually putting them in that burn pile, and it re-inoculates it, so it actually recovers much quickly. Much quickly? What the hell is that?